I keep thinking that Alexander Hamilton would be saying, let's go, let's move along here. Let's use everything we can to break this virus.
Hi, and welcome to Conversations Beneath the Cupola, a Gettysburg College podcast. I'm Bob Iuliano, president of the college and your host. As the global outbreak of COVID-19 continues to progress, we are all trying to make sense of the significant changes that have been made to the way we live. During this time, we are using this podcast to explore the uncertainty that surrounds some of these changes with the guidance and expertise of Gettysburg faculty. Today, we are joined by Bruce Larson, chair and professor of political science at the college. A specialist in American political institutions and processes, he teaches and conducts researches on a variety of topics, including the U.S. Congress, political parties, and elections. Bruce will use this background to help us make sense of how the COVID-19 outbreak has and will continue to impact ongoing primary elections across the country, how the administration's response to the healthcare crisis today may affect the presidential election in November, and so much more. So Bruce, over the past couple of weeks, I've really had the privilege of interviewing a couple of your and my colleagues on the faculty. How do you evaluate this in the political side? Is there any analog to this that we should be having in mind? Any lessons that we ought to be taking from this? I'm mindful of yesterday's events in Wisconsin where people had to choose between voting and their well-being. How do we make sense of this from a political angle, looking back over time?
Well, I think, Bob, the combination here of several things, right, of severe economic fallout, of an ongoing presidential campaign in which, as you point out, it's a health risk to show up at the polls, and the uncertainty about how long the closures will last make this context fairly unique in American political history. I think I was thinking about history a little bit, and we'll have to get some historians in on this, but maybe the closest historical analog, at least absent the economic fallout, was the flu pandemic of 1918 in the United States, which, by the way, killed 675,000 Americans.
Which is staggering. You think about that as a percentage of the population?
Absolutely, which was much smaller then. So state and local governments still managed to coordinate and hold the 1918 midterm elections. It was a midterm elections. And some states did some innovative things. Nebraska, for example, lifted the statewide ban on public gatherings 5 days before the elections, so candidates could go out and campaign. My understanding was there were some negative health consequences of that as well. Turnout was really low in 1918, though, even for a midterm election. So, and I'll note then the stakes were high, right? World War I was winding down. Woodrow Wilson's Democrats were trying to fight to hold on to their majorities in Congress. And by the way, they failed. Republicans ended up winning control of both chambers back for the first time in a decade.
So you note that the Wilson didn't succeed. That sort of bears on a question that's been on my mind, and that is, how do we think about the legitimacy of a democratic process when events like this take place and necessarily circumscribe, even now, the capacity of candidates to have the sort of attention that they would otherwise have to talk to the American public about their ideas?
My assumption is that higher voter turnout leads to more democratic legitimacy. You want public engagement in these big questions. And it becomes, at least for me, problematic when people do need to make a choice between risking their health and showing up at the polls. And so I think there are some questions of legitimacy here. Let me point out, too, that, and this, of course, isn't because of politics, but so far the pandemic seems to have had a greater effect on blue states, not because they're blue states, but because blue states tend to be more urban and densely populated. And so that also can play into some of these questions of legitimacy as well. So we'll have to see. I mean, it's not something we want to play with, right? People want to feel like elections were won on an even playing field and fairly and squarely. And if people don't feel like they can come out to vote without risking health, that I think poses problems.
So you mentioned that Nebraska opened 5 days early to let candidates campaign, but it had negative health consequences. So you've seen states today react in very different ways to the challenges associated with running elections. Some states have deferred. Wisconsin went ahead. The governor was trying to think about whether there were alternative means of conducting an election. Have you seen examples of alternative means other than in-person voting happen on a large scale? Another way perhaps of asking this question is, how practical is it that the government in short notice could stand up a new means of conducting an election that would still be fair and that wouldn't have problems of fraud or other voter issues that may have the same effect of undermining legitimacy?
Yeah, that's a great question. Well, let me say first, there are indeed effective alternatives to in-person voting, and namely that's mail-in balloting. Currently, there are actually 3 states, Oregon and Washington State and Colorado, where voting is conducted exclusively by mail. That's the way it occurs. And actually, for most of California, most precincts in California, that is true as well. And so this already exists. Actually, my understanding of Oregon is that it has been using mail-in balloting since 1998. So it's not even necessarily a new thing.
I confess I did not know that. That's a really interesting fact.
Yeah, and so, but as you point out, there are logistical and actually political difficulties for many states to implement mail-in voting by 2020 in a relatively short time. So let's start with logistical, right? Many states are just overwhelmed right now, trying to contain the spread of COVID-19. And many states are also facing staggering budget losses of budget revenues. Governor Hogan in Maryland, Bob Hogan, for example, estimated the state would probably lose 20 to 30% of its budget revenues. And so there are those difficulties. Now, of course, Congress could help pay for some of these if it wanted to do that. And I think this, to some extent, is where partisan politics comes into play. There's a strong sense that, and I say this as an observer, not as a partisan, so there's a strong sense among both Democrats and Republicans that mail-in balloting benefits Democrats. And that makes sense, right? Democrats tend to have a more, at least to some extent, lower income constituency, not completely. And the barriers on low income people are higher for voting already. And so when you lower the barriers, it tends to help people that tend to, but not always vote for Democrats. And so not surprisingly, Democrats favor mail-in balloting far more than Republicans do. And we saw that happen. We saw this play out in Wisconsin for the past couple of days, right? There's a bunch of bills floating around right now in Congress. For example, there's a bill by Amy Klobuchar, senator from Minnesota, and Ron Wyden from Oregon, that would mandate that states provide voters with so-called no excuse necessary absentee ballots and or printable ballots, the latter of which are reserved exclusively right now for overseas and military voters. The bill authorizes Congress to pay for states for the cost of implementing it. So there are a couple of bills in place. I looked at that legislation. So far, it has 24 co-sponsors, all of whom are Democrats, not surprisingly.
Well, again, for the reason.
And that's a signal to me that this is not going to go anywhere, at least not now, and at least not in its current form.
Well, this may then raise the question of, we have seen in the primaries, the states and to some extent the parties control the rules for voting. I was, as you know, I was a government major in my college. You think I would know the answer to this, but I don't. Who controls the rules and access to the ballot box in the national election, in the presidential election? Are those rules still set by states, or is it
It's
set
a
by the
mix.
United States government?
It's a mix. So campaign finance laws, for example, are for federal elections are all set at the national level by Congress. But state voting rules are set by states for the most part. It's a mix though, right? Because there are various constitutional amendments saying what states can't do, right, in terms of voting requirements. And so it's a real mix of both state law, and by state law I mean, are we going to have early ballot voting? Are we going to have a week earlier than the election to allow people to come to the voting booth? Are we going to have mail-in balloting? Those questions are state questions. Questions about who has the right to vote and preventing discrimination at the state level have been federal questions, and campaign finance as well.
Could the federal government, if it wanted to, come in and preempt the field and say, in light of the circumstances unusual as they are this year, we're going to impose a uniform set of rules on the way in which this election takes place?
Sure. I mean, Congress can do anything. I mean, it has broad powers. Now, that probably wouldn't happen because there's a lot of opposition to it.
And there's a divided House in the Senate, and yes.
Yeah, and it would be, we have a more conservative court right now that would very likely consider that an overreach of congressional power that Congress should not be exercising. This is something like, for example, under the Warren Court that might have happened, but not now. And here's an example of this, and I'm not sure that people know this. Part of the Wisconsin law, and that was a push to by a lower federal court, I think, to expand, and I don't know exactly the details on this, to expand the postmark date for absentee ballots past the election day. I believe a federal court upheld that, and the Supreme Court turned it down.
Just the other day.
Said that federal courts ought not to be in the business of changing election laws so close to election day. And so there's an incredible amount of conflict in this area. And of course, let me say one last thing on that too, Bob. Partly because of the court's decision in Shelby County versus Holden in 2013, where the court gutted Section 4B of the Voting Rights Act, the reauthorization of the Voting Rights Act in 2006, states have had more latitude now on the extent to which they can pass things like voter ID laws. And right, because these states don't need federal preclearance anymore as they used to need.
And it is interesting. I have not read the Supreme Court's decision, but obviously it didn't seem to take cognizance of the fact that this was an unusual moment in time, and it applied its prior precedent somewhat automatically rather than, I don't mean this as a criticism as much as I do as an observation, rather than really diving into the unusual moment and whether that might justify a different way of looking at the precedent that was established. Again, not as a criticism, really just more as an observation.
Absolutely.
So one of the things that you and I have spent time in my short time on this campus talking about is the regrettable rise of polarization in all aspects of American life, but particularly in American political life. It has often been said that nothing like a good crisis to find common ground. Do you see any signs that this crisis is beginning to create the possibility of more common ground, particularly in Washington? And if you're not seeing it now, do you see the possibility from it that it is coming down the road?
I want to see it, but I don't actually. At least maybe at the community and state and local level, we'll see more unity as communities kind of rally around and gather around each other to help people. But I have to say, I think at the national level in particular, I think the country will remain fairly divided. And I think that for several reasons. And I've been thinking a lot about this year and have been reading a lot about it. And so here's the way I'm thinking about this. So most people just don't pay that much attention to politics, right? And you and I are fascinated by this, and we could talk about it endlessly, and we want everyone to share our passion, but they don't, right? They're busy. They have a multitude of different interests, and there are a lot of things, more than ever, in fact, now competing for their attention, right? And the result is that people rely on cognitive shortcuts, right? In particular, now their political and social identities in interpreting politics and in making their vote choices as well. In the last 2 decades, we've seen an increase in the effect of party identification. In other words, the attachment one has to a party. And it's become almost inseparable from someone's social identity now. And that's loomed large as a lens through which people interpret and absorb political events right now. And key to this way of thinking about it is that a lot of people now surround themselves with friends and inhabit media echo chambers that reinforce their existing political and partisan beliefs. And so here's a great example. And Pew Center for People in the Press has done some great survey work on this. And I love Pew because they put their data online for number crunchers like me to download and then use in my classes and things. So they put a survey in the field at the end of March asking respondents how much confidence they had in President Trump's handling of the crisis. And actually, the results are really instructive. Among Republican respondents, 90% said they were somewhat or very confident in the president's ability to handle the crisis. In contrast, among Democratic respondents, that number was 13%. 68% of Democrats said they had no confidence at all. At 38%, independents, which there are fewer now, were somewhere in between. They were looking a bit more like Democrats. So people are looking even at this event. It's the same event for everybody. We're looking at it through a partisan lens. And reinforcing all of this is that there's a presidential campaign going on right now. And campaigns are inherently divisive, right? The aim for each side in any campaign is to distinguish themselves from the other side. And so that's going to reinforce, I think, this divide. And you're going to see it pop up on voting, on mail-in balloting, and so on.
So you know that one of my themes has been figuring out how we can reinforce this college's orientation towards creating people who are engaged in the world, who build bridges, build coalitions to reach across difference effectively. All of these impulses are pushing in different directions. By the way, that's not quite the same as saying we want to graduate centrists.
No, not at all.
That's not the proposition. Rather, the proposition is we want to graduate people with capacious minds, the ability to hear and listen, absorb, take in argument, evaluate their own position openly and with some honesty behind that. So all of these impulses that you've identified strike me as pushing against that direction. And so I guess my question is this. If a moment like this doesn't begin to cause those sinews to loosen a little bit, what will? That is, are we in this trend of hyperpolarization indefinitely in your view?
No, I think, and I'm gonna be optimistic here, but I'm also in being optimistic, attribute a role to ourselves. I think we can maybe grow out of it. And by grow out of it, I mean, we demonstrate for students how problematic this is. And we can say to students, and I've been trying to think about how to say this, and it sort of is consistent with what we're saying, we don't need to graduate centrists. Is there something called a kind of good partisanship? And I think there is, right? I think a good partisan is someone who stands for principle or for something publicly, but to recognize that he or she does not see the whole of things, and to be intensely curious about those things you don't see it.
I like that. I would add one other thing, and to recognize that particularly in the world of governance, there is a responsibility to govern the polity as a whole. And it's not just a winner-take-all system. And that sometime compromise, which right now in Washington seems unpopular, has a value because it broadens legitimacy across the entire political spectrum, and we all have a stake in a government that is understood to be legitimate. That's my own personal view.
I love that.
For whatever it's worth. So you probably occasionally ask your students to engage in acts of conjecture, so I will ask you to do so as well. How do you see the virus and the economic, social dislocation that we have experienced? What do you see its impact being on the general election in the fall? And you can answer that either substantively in outcomes or process-based, however you imagine it.
Well, it's the big question, right? And it's one of the big questions. And I'm gonna preface my answer with a caveat that there's so much uncertainty right now. But I will say this, and again, given that people absorb political information now through a highly partisan lens, and that campaigns are designed to reinforce and activate that partisanship, remind voters of it, I think this could be another close election. I don't think it's like 1932, where voters deserted Hoover in droves, and